The recording device shouldn't have been warm to the touch, but Violet's fingers recoiled anyway. She set the digital recorder on the metal table, watching condensation form around its edges despite the basement's bone-dry air. The temperature gauge read 58 degrees, same as it had for the past 3 hours, but sweat beaded along her hairline. Something fundamental felt wrong about the space beneath Millbrook Presbyterian Church, though she couldn't identify what her instruments weren't detecting. The basement stretched 30 feet in each direction, lined with gray concrete blocks that had been painted white sometime in the 1970s. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in the particular shade of institutional green that made people look seasoned or dead. 6 folding chairs sat arranged in a circle near the far wall, exactly where Reverend Marsh had described finding them every morning for the past 2 weeks. No one in the congregation admitted to moving the chairs. Violet checked her electromagnetic field detector, then her thermal imaging camera, then the digital recorder again. All functioning normally, all showing readings consistent with an empty church basement in October. The EMF detector registered baseline electromagnetic activity. The thermal camera showed uniform temperature distribution. The audio recorder captured only the building's mechanical systems and her own breathing. Yet the air felt thick enough to chew. She walked the perimeter of the room, running her fingertips along the painted concrete. The walls felt oddly soft, as though the paint had never quite dried. When she pulled her hand away, her fingertips came back clean, but the sensation of moisture lingered. She wiped her palm on her jeans and immediately regretted the gesture. The fabric felt too rough against skin that suddenly seemed too sensitive. The folding chairs drew her attention again. Metal frames, vinyl seats in that particular shade of brown that suggested institutional procurement circa 1980. Nothing unusual about them individually, but their arrangement nagged at her. Perfect circle, no gaps, each chair facing inward with mathematical precision. The kind of placement that required measurement, planning, intention. But who would take that much care arranging chairs in a church basement at night? Violet approached the circle, stopping just outside its perimeter. The EMF detector remained silent. The thermal camera showed nothing. But her skin prickled with the distinct sensation of being observed, evaluated, judged by something that existed just beyond the reach of electronic measurement. She stepped into the circle. The air pressure changed immediately, a subtle shift that made her ears pop and her sinuses ache. The fluorescent lights flickered once, casting everything in momentary shadow before resuming their steady hum. When the light stabilized, the chairs seemed closer together, though she knew that was impossible. The digital recorder beeped softly. Recording stopped. Violet lifted the device, checking its LED display. Memory full, despite having cleared it completely before entering the basement. She pressed play, expecting to hear her own voice describing her initial observations, but the speaker crackled with something else entirely. Whispers. Dozens of them, layered over each other in a linguistic pattern she couldn't identify. Not quite English, not quite anything else. The voices rose and fell in what might have been conversation or might have been prayer, impossible to distinguish individual words, but unmistakably human in origin. Female voices mostly, with a few deeper tones that could have been elderly men or women worn down by years of speaking in whispers. The recording played for 14 minutes. She had been in the basement for less than 10. Violet rewound the file, listening again. This time she caught fragments that sounded like English, broken phrases that emerged from the multilingual murmur like objects surfacing in dark water. Beneath the careful, never meant to wake, hands remember what hearts forget. She comes bearing questions we cannot answer. That last phrase made her check over her shoulder, though she knew she was alone. The basement felt smaller than when she'd entered, as though the walls had crept inward while her attention was focused on the recording. She measured the space with her eyes, trying to remember its exact dimensions, but the fluorescent lighting made accurate assessment difficult. Everything looked the same yet subtly different, like a photograph that had been digitally altered in ways too minor to identify. The chairs definitely seemed closer together. Violet saved the audio file to her phone and reset the digital recorder, though her hands shook enough to make the simple task frustrating. The whispers had stopped, but silence felt worse. At least the voices suggested human presence, even if she couldn't see their source. Silence in a space that should contain someone or something felt like holding her breath underwater. She checked her phone for the time. 11:47 p.m. She'd entered the basement at 11:15, which meant she'd been down here for 32 minutes, not 10. The missing time made her stomach clench with the particular nausea that accompanies realizing you've been wrong about something fundamental. Time shouldn't be negotiable in a church basement. Her phone also showed 17 missed calls from Dr. Reeves, her research supervisor at the university. Strange. Marcus knew she'd be conducting field research tonight and had specifically requested minimal contact unless she encountered immediate danger. She called him back, but the line went straight to voicemail. When she tried again, her phone showed no signal despite having full bars moments earlier. The basement's concrete walls couldn't block cellular signals. She'd checked before coming down. Violet looked at her phone again. No signal. No missed calls. No saved audio file. According to the device, she'd never recorded anything at all. The folding chairs sat in their perfect circle, but now she noticed something that definitely hadn't been there before. A small pile of what looked like photographs sat on the seat of the chair directly across from where she stood. Black and white images, old enough that their edges had gone soft and yellow. She approached slowly, her footsteps echoing strangely in the confined space. The sound seemed to take too long to fade, as though the basement was larger than its walls suggested. When she reached the chair, she picked up the top photograph and immediately wished she hadn't. The image showed 6 women sitting in folding chairs arranged in a circle. Same chairs, same basement, but decades earlier based on their clothing and hairstyles. The women looked directly at the camera, with expressions that suggested they'd been interrupted in the middle of something important. Their hands were clasped in their laps, and each wore what appeared to be a small metal pendant around her neck. But their eyes were completely black. Not the pupils, not the irises. The entire visible portion of each eye was solid black, reflecting the camera's flash like polished obsidian. The women smiled pleasantly, as though nothing was unusual about their appearance, as though having eyes like empty sockets was perfectly normal for a church gathering. Violet flipped to the next photograph. Same women, same chairs, but this time they were standing. Their arms hung at their sides, and those terrible black eyes stared directly into the camera with an intensity that made her skin crawl. One of the women, an elderly lady with gray hair pinned back in a neat bun, appeared to be mouthing words, though the photograph captured no sound. The third photograph showed the circle of chairs empty, except for shadows that didn't correspond to any visible objects. The shadows were human-shaped, sitting upright in each chair as though cast by people who weren't there. The basement looked exactly as it did now, down to the particular pattern of fluorescent light on the painted concrete walls, except for the shadows, which suggested the presence of 6 people who couldn't be seen. A sound from upstairs made Violet freeze. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, crossing the floor of the church sanctuary directly above her head. The building should have been empty. Reverend Marsh had given her the key personally and assured her that no one else would be in the building until morning services. The footsteps stopped directly overhead, then resumed moving in what sounded like a circle. Around and around, like someone pacing or dancing or performing some kind of ritual that required precise movement and careful timing. Violet stuffed the photographs in her jacket pocket and headed for the basement stairs, but stopped before reaching the first step. The EMF detector in her other hand suddenly erupted in a cacophony of clicks and electronic squeals. The needle pegged into the red zone and stayed there, indicating electromagnetic activity far beyond anything that should exist in a church basement. She checked the thermal imaging camera. 6 bright spots appeared on the screen, each corresponding to the location of a folding chair. Human-shaped heat signatures, sitting upright, visible through electronic sensors, but not to the naked eye. The footsteps overhead grew louder, more insistent, as though whoever was walking had decided stealth was no longer necessary. Multiple sets now, at least 6 pairs of feet moving in the same circular pattern. The sound was directly above the circle of chairs, as though the upstairs activity was connected to whatever was happening in the basement. Violet looked at the chairs again. Still empty to her eyes, but the thermal camera showed 6 distinct figures, each radiating body heat in the distinctive pattern of living humans. The EMF detector continued its electronic screaming, and now she could smell something that definitely hadn't been there before. Flowers. Old flowers, past their prime, sweet and cloying with the particular scent of decay that accompanies funeral arrangements left too long in closed spaces. The basement had no flowers, never had, according to Reverend Marsh. The church stored folding tables down here, extra hymnals, cleaning supplies. Nothing organic, nothing that could rot or produce the sick sweet smell that now filled her nostrils and made her gag. She checked the digital recorder, still showing empty memory, despite having captured 14 minutes of whispered conversation just minutes earlier. But when she held it near the circle of chairs, its LED display flickered and numbers appeared that looked like a countdown. 5:47, 5:46, 5:45. The footsteps overhead stopped abruptly, replaced by a different sound. Singing, female voices, harmonizing in what might have been a hymn if the melody weren't completely wrong. The tune was recognizable, something she'd heard in churches before, but the words were in that same unidentifiable language she'd heard in the recording that no longer existed. And the voices were coming from below her feet, not above. Violet looked down at the concrete floor. The sound was definitely rising from beneath the basement, as though there was another level to the building that wasn't on any blueprint. The singing grew louder, more confident, and she could make out individual voices within the harmony. 6 women, just like in the photographs, performing what sounded like a welcoming song. The countdown on the digital recorder reached 0 and everything stopped. No singing, no footsteps, no EMF readings, no heat signatures on the thermal camera. The basement returned to its previous state of oppressive silence, but now that silence felt intentional, deliberate, like the pause between question and answer. Violet backed toward the stairs, her instruments useless in hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The photographs in her jacket pocket felt heavier than they should, as though they contained more than just images. When she reached the first step, she looked back at the circle of chairs one final time. 6 women sat in perfect stillness, visible now to her naked eyes as clearly as they'd appeared on the thermal camera. The same women from the photographs, wearing the same clothing, the same pleasant expressions, the same terrible black eyes. They watched her with interest but not surprise, as though they'd been expecting her arrival and were pleased she'd finally joined them. The elderly woman with the gray hair smiled and patted the seat of an empty chair that had materialized beside her. There are 7 chairs now, not 6. Violet ran. She took the basement stairs 3 at a time, her equipment clattering against the walls as she climbed. The sanctuary was empty, exactly as it should have been, but the air felt thick with the lingering scent of old flowers and something else. Something medical, antiseptic, like the smell of a hospital room where someone had died peacefully after a long illness. The front door was locked from the inside, just as she'd left it, but the key wouldn't turn. She tried again, forcing herself to breathe slowly, to think clearly, to remember that panic makes fine motor control impossible. The key turned on the 4th attempt, and she stumbled out into the October night. The church parking lot was empty except for her car, parked exactly where she'd left it under the single functioning streetlight. Everything looked normal, ordinary, safe. The kind of scene that would photograph beautifully and tell observers nothing about the horror contained within those brick walls and concrete foundation. She got in her car and locked the doors, then immediately started the engine and drove away without looking back. She had enough experience with supernatural investigation to know that looking back was always a mistake. Whatever wanted her attention would be standing in the church doorway, or at the basement window, or in the back seat of her car, and seeing it would make everything worse. 3 blocks from the church, she pulled into the parking lot of a 24-hour diner and finally allowed herself to check the rearview mirror. Empty back seat, empty parking lot behind her. Just the normal late-night landscape of a small town where nothing interesting ever happened. Her hands had stopped shaking, but the photographs in her jacket pocket still felt heavy and warm against her ribs. She pulled them out, expecting to see the same terrible images of women with black eyes sitting in folding chairs, but the photographs showed something different now. 7 women. Same chairs, same basement, same pleasant expressions. But now one of the women had brown hair cut in a chin-length bob and wore jeans and a dark jacket instead of the vintage clothing the others displayed. The newest woman had Violet's face. In the photograph, she was smiling the same confident smile as the others, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes completely black. She looked comfortable, settled, as though she'd been part of the group for years instead of minutes. The other women welcomed her with their expressions, acknowledged her as one of their own, accepted her presence as natural and right. Violet stared at her own face in the photograph, trying to remember sitting in that chair, trying to recall the moment when the camera captured her image. She had no memory of posing, no recollection of joining the circle, no awareness of when her eyes had changed color. But she remembered the singing. She remembered the harmony, the way her voice had blended with the others in perfect synchronization. She remembered the words, though she couldn't understand them, and the melody that felt like coming home after years of wandering. She remembered the warmth of belonging, the comfort of being welcomed, the relief of finally finding her place among people who understood what she was searching for. The basement under Millbrook Presbyterian Church was empty now. 6 folding chairs arranged in a perfect circle, waiting for the next meeting, the next gathering, the next opportunity to welcome someone new into their community. But sometimes, on quiet October nights, when the wind carries the scent of old flowers and forgotten prayers, 7 women sit in that circle, sharing stories and singing hymns in a language that exists only in the space between question and answer. And sometimes, if you listen carefully, you can hear them welcoming the 8th.